The precise click of the ancient clock on Marcus's desk was the loudest sound in his apartment, a rhythmic counterpoint to the rustle of turning pages. His world was one of meticulous research, of dusty archives and forgotten texts. He preferred the silent company of history to the unpredictable chaos of human interaction. A reclusive historian, Marcus found solace in deciphering the intricate patterns of the past, a task that demanded rigorous logic and an unwavering skepticism toward the anecdotal. He considered himself a rational man, grounded in empirical evidence. Superstition was merely the detritus of unexamined fear, unworthy of serious academic consideration. His current project, a comprehensive study of obscure medieval land disputes, required absolute concentration. The arrival of a registered letter, thick with legal documents and bearing an unfamiliar seal, was an unwelcome intrusion. He had no living relatives he was aware of, certainly none who would necessitate such formal communication. The envelope felt heavy in his hand, substantial, almost portly. He slid it open with the precise edge of a brass letter opener, a gift from a former colleague who had since given up academia for a more lucrative, if less intellectually stimulating, career. The contents were succinct, delivered in the clipped, formal language of a solicitor. A distant, forgotten relative, a great-aunt twice removed, had passed away, and Marcus, to his profound bewilderment, was his sole inheritor. The inheritance was not a sum of money, nor a collection of antique coins, but a property. Blackwood Manor. The name, even on the crisp parchment, carried a faint, unsettling resonance. He consulted his digital archives. Blackwood Manor. The results were immediate and extensive, though not in the way he expected. Local legends, rather than architectural schematics, dominated the early entries. Tales of unexplained disappearances, of madness descending upon its inhabitants, of a pervasive chill that defied explanation. The local folklore painted it as a place of profound ill omen, a site where shadows clung to the very stones. He dismissed it all with a dismissive wave of his hand, a physical gesture of intellectual superiority. Superstition. Rustic anxieties projected onto an old edifice. He imagined a crumbling, drafty pile, perhaps with a leaky roof, but nothing more. A follow-up letter from the solicitor arrived 2 days later, reiterating the terms and providing directions. The manor was situated deep within a remote stretch of countryside, accessible only by a winding, narrow track that culminated in a steep ascent through a mountain pass. The remoteness appealed to Marcus's reclusive nature, a place where the internet signal might be weak, where the nearest town was a distant dot on a map. Ideal for undisturbed research. He decided to visit, to assess the property, perhaps to liquidate it. The market for ancient, reputedly cursed manors was likely limited, but the land itself might hold value. The drive was long, the landscape gradually shedding the familiar signs of civilization. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to packed earth. The trees grew taller, denser, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dim canopy. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He navigated the treacherous curves of the mountain pass, the car's engine grunting in protest against the incline. Sheer rock faces rose on one side, a dizzying drop on the other, shrouded in mist that seemed to cling to the peaks even at midday. The only sounds were the crunch of tires and the distant cry of an unseen bird. A sense of isolation settled over him, not unpleasant but profound. Finally, after hours of relentless driving, the track broadened into a neglected drive. A pair of colossal, wrought iron gates, rusted and half obscured by overgrown ivy, stood ajar. Beyond them, a long, winding avenue, choked with weeds and fallen leaves, led into a gloom so dense it seemed to swallow the light. Blackwood Manor emerged from the twilight like a skeletal hand reaching from the earth. Turrets rose into the bruised sky, capped with slate tiles that glinted dully. Sections of the roof had collapsed, leaving ragged gaps. The air was still, heavy, pressing down on him. There was no birdsong, no rustle of leaves, only the almost imperceptible hum of his own blood in his ears. The manor loomed, a monolithic presence. It did not merely stand, it brooded. He extracted the heavy iron key from his pocket given to him by the solicitor. He approached the colossal oak front door, which was studded with corroded iron. The wood was warped, scarred by centuries of weather and neglect. He pushed the door inward. It was the scent of forgotten things, of time itself slowly eroding. Marcus stepped across the threshold. The door swung shut behind him with a soft, deliberate thud that resonated through the stone, plunging the hall into an even deeper gloom. A prickle of unease, sharp and unwelcome, traced its way up his spine. This was not merely an old house, it was a tomb, and he was standing inside it. The ancient manor loomed, a silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Marcus observed it from the winding approach, the final stretch of a journey that had taken him through a desolate mountain pass, its crags dark and forbidding. The air grew perceptibly colder as the vehicle, a borrowed estate car laden with his research materials, ascended the final incline. He noted the precise angle of the roof line, the weathered stone of the chimney stacks, the way the skeletal branches of an oak clawed at an upper window. It was, he mused, a magnificent specimen of antiquated architecture, ripe for historical dissection. Superstition, he knew, was merely a misinterpretation of historical record, a primitive attempt to explain the inexplicable. He intended to strip away the folklore and expose the mundane truth. The solicitor, a thin man with perpetually damp hands, had met him at the gates, keys jingling like a nervous bell. A brief, perfunctory tour had followed, the solicitor speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the legacy and the unfortunate circumstances of the previous owners. Marcus had paid little attention to the man's pronouncements, his gaze fixed instead on the intricate carvings of a newel post, the faded tapestry depicting a forgotten hunting scene. The first week was dedicated to organization. Boxes of books, bound journals, and meticulously indexed files were unpacked. He established his temporary study in what appeared to be the manor's original library, a room lined with shelves that held the accumulated dust of centuries. The air here was heavy, smelling of old paper, dry rot, and something else, something subtly metallic, like distant rain on an iron roof. He worked with methodical precision, arranging his own collection alongside the manor's neglected literary treasures. It was not the general coolness of an old, unheated building, but a concentrated pocket of frigidity that seemed to hover, unmoving. Marcus paused, his hands suspended. He attributed it to a compromised seal in the window frame, a common issue in structures of this age. He made a mental note to investigate the sash. He straightened, head cocked. The sound was gone. He listened, straining. Nothing but the creak of the old house settling, the distant groan of timbers. He was alone. There was no other explanation. The following morning, he found his fountain pen, which he had left meticulously kept beside his open notebook, resting instead on the mantelpiece of the fireplace, several feet away. Marcus frowned. He was fastidious about his implements. He knew precisely where he had placed it. He considered the possibility of the solicitor's assistant having returned, but the man had been adamant about leaving him undisturbed. Perhaps, he thought, he had moved it himself in a moment of absent-mindedness, a subconscious action he had simply forgotten. His mind, after all, was often consumed by the minutiae of historical fact, not the placement of writing tools. He retrieved the pen, a flicker of irritation rather than unease crossing his features. It was while clearing a lower shelf filled with mildewed theological tracts that his hand brushed against a concealed recess. Behind a false panel, crudely disguised, he found a small, locked wooden box. The lock was rusted, easily forced with a sturdy letter opener. Inside lay a stack of yellowed, brittle journals bound in cracking leather. The earliest bore a date from the late 17th century. Marcus's historian's instinct flared. This was a true find. He carefully opened the first journal. The script was spidery, faded, but legible. The entries detailed the mundane activities of a manor owner, a man named Bartholomew. But as Marcus turned the pages, a shift in tone became apparent. Bartholomew's entries grew increasingly agitated. The drafts are relentless. One entry read, dated 1698, it is not empty. It is watchful. Marcus paused, a faint echo of the cold spot and the whisper in his own experience resonating, though he quickly suppressed the connection. He continued reading. Bartholomew wrote of an inexplicable lassitude, a draining of spirit. My memories, an entry from 1701 stated, they fray at the edges. Names, faces, they slip like sand through a sieve. The house seems to absorb them. Marcus's brow furrowed. He recognized the symptoms, signs of early dementia, perhaps, or a neurological decline, a common plight in an era without modern medicine. He noted the precise dates, intrigued by the progression of the man's perceived affliction. He turned to a later journal, belonging to a different owner, a woman named Alina, from the mid-19th century. Her script was more elegant, but her words carried a similar strain. The house shifts, she wrote, her hand trembling even on the page. Not in stone, but in disposition. It feels hungry. It listens to my thoughts, and then it takes. Small things at first, a forgotten melody, a childhood rhyme. But now my earliest joys feel distant, like another's dream. Marcus felt a peculiar prickle on his skin. Yet, the phrasing of it takes and it listens carried a distinct, unsettling resonance with the local legends he had so readily dismissed. He told himself it was simply the poetic license of a mind under duress. He closed the journal, placing it carefully on his desk. The metallic scent in the air seemed to intensify, no longer just distant rain, but something closer, sharper, like freshly turned earth. Marcus, despite his meticulous rationality, found himself listening to it intently. Marcus returned to the library, the scent of aged paper and dust a constant companion. The unsettling resonance from the previous evening had faded, replaced by his characteristic academic resolve. He arranged his notes, a meticulous array of dates and names, preparing to delve deeper into the manor's records. He aimed to construct a definitive timeline of ownership, a factual bulwark against the local fables. A faint rasping sound, like sandpaper against dry wood, scraped at the edge of his hearing. He paused, pencil hovering over a ledger. The manor was old, its timbers contracting, its foundations settling. But then, a distinct click, sharp and metallic, echoed from the floor above. Not the groan of old floorboards, but something deliberate. He strained his ears. Silence! He resumed his work, but the clinical focus wavered, a minute tremor beneath his concentration. Later, as dusk bled through the tall, grimy windows, painting the library in shades of bruised plum, Marcus saw it. A flicker, a dense, shapeless mass that seemed to detach itself from the deep shadow pooling behind a towering bookcase. It receded instantly, dissolving before he could properly register its form. His breath hitched. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue, he concluded. The poor light, the strain of deciphering faded script. He switched on a powerful desk lamp, banishing the encroaching gloom from his immediate vicinity. But the periphery remained a shifting canvas of deeper shades. He found himself glancing up more frequently, his gaze darting to the edges of his vision. Sleep offered no reprieve. The nights were a fractured tapestry of unease. Marcus dreamt of the manor, but it was not the dusty, silent structure he inhabited. They were indistinct, a rising tide of desperate, unintelligible murmurings that pressed in on him. Despite the exhaustion, a new urgency propelled his back to the archives. He sought patterns, correlations. He had dismissed the legends, but now, the accounts of it takes and it listens from the previous chapter resonated with an uncomfortable persistence. He sifted through brittle deeds, probate records, and fragmented personal correspondence. The names blurred. Alden, Blackwood, Thorne, Viridian, a succession of owners, each inheriting the manor, each spending prolonged periods within its walls. He found a series of letters from a distant relative of the Alden family, expressing concern about the patriarch's increasing reclusiveness and unpredictable moods. A later entry of formal legal document detailed the sale of the manor after the patriarch's unexplained disappearance. Then, a mention of the Blackwood family, specifically a matriarch who, according to a local newspaper clipping, had been found wandering the mountain pass in a state of profound disorientation, eventually succumbing to an unspecified debilitating illness shortly after returning. The Thorne family's tenure ended with a terse note in a parish register. Self-inflicted demise within the manor walls. The Viridians, a solitary scholar like Marcus, simply vanished, leaving behind only his meticulously kept, but increasingly erratic, journals. It wasn't just isolated incidents. It was a sequence, a grotesque historical narrative unfolding before him. Each inhabitant, especially those who lived in prolonged isolation within the manor, succumbed to a similar fate. Madness, disappearance, or suicide. The common thread was not just the house, but the duration of their stay, the intensity of their immersion. His initial skepticism began to fray, exposing raw nerves. He had sought facts, and the facts were coalescing into something far more terrifying than superstition. The manor wasn't merely old, it was a hungry maw. He ran a hand over the rough, cold stone of the library wall, a shiver tracing a path down his spine. Had the previous owners felt this same unsettling texture? Had they heard the faint, insistent rustling that now seemed to emanate directly from the mortar? Then, a low, guttural murmur too deep to be human, too close to be outside, vibrated against his eardrum. It felt ancient, primordial, a sound that had been waiting patiently for him to listen. He pulled back sharply, his breath catching in his throat, his rational mind struggling to construct an explanation that now felt impossibly thin. The historical patterns Marcus had meticulously catalogued now formed a chilling mosaic. He sat at the polished mahogany desk in the library, surrounded by the remnants of lives extinguished too soon, too violently. Each name, each date, each account of despair echoed the last, a repeating motif of degradation and demise. His initial, clinical detachment had frayed, replaced by a cold, creeping certainty. The manor wasn't merely a backdrop to these tragedies, it was the orchestrator. The air in the library, usually still, seemed to thicken, pressing in on him. A faint, cloying scent, like decaying roses and damp earth, wafted past, though no flowers were present and the windows remained shut. He was examining a faded ledger from the mid-1800s detailing the expense expenses of a former resident, a solitary artist known only as the painter. The entries grew erratic towards the end, scrawled with increasing desperation. A low, guttural murmur, too indistinct to be words, resonated from the very walls, a vibration felt more in his bones than heard by his ears. He rose, pacing the room. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, but then a lighter, faster set of footsteps joined his own, echoing from the floor above. He stopped, listening intently. He strained, but the sound did not return. Later that evening, while attempting to transcribe notes in his study, the intrusions intensified. He felt a distinct shift in the ambient temperature, a sudden, icy breath on his neck, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. He spun around, expecting to see a draft, but the heavy curtains were still, the window sealed. His hand trembled as he reached for his pen. He tried to rationalize it, attributing the phenomenon to stress, to the suggestive atmosphere of the manor, to his subconscious desire to find what he sought. But the sensory details were too sharp, too specific. The faint, sweet metallic tang that now permeated the air like old blood was not imaginary. His skepticism, a carefully constructed fortress, began to show cracks. He was no longer merely observing, he was experiencing. He was becoming part of the narrative. The air grew dense, suffocating. He was no longer in his study. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see his own, but they were gnarled, rough, calloused, clutching a heavy, rusty trap. The scent of fear, raw and primal, filled his nostrils. He heard the distant baying of hounds, not from outside the manor, but as if they were closing in on him. A voice, hoarse with panic, ripped through his mind, not his own voice, but a desperate plea for escape. The snow-dusted rocks, the biting wind, the sheer, indifferent scale of the landscape amplified a desperate sense of being trapped, hunted. He was simultaneously himself, Marcus, the historian, and the gamekeeper, lost in the icy wilderness. The vision fractured, the trees receded, the gray twilight dissolved. He was back in his study, slumped over the desk, gasping for air, the ledger pages scattered around him. His hands, his own hands, were shaking violently. The scent of pine and damp earth still clung to him, a phantom residue. This was a hallucination born of a tired mind. This was an experience, vivid and visceral, a direct conduit to the past. The manor was not simply a repository of memories, it was a living, breathing entity that consumed and regurgitated the experiences of its inhabitants, forcing them upon the present. It didn't just haunt, it absorbed. He looked around the study, the familiar objects now imbued with a menacing stillness. The unseen presence was no longer a vague sensation. The air in the room, usually thick with the scent of aged paper and beeswax, now seemed to carry a faint, metallic tang like old blood. He needed to leave. Not permanently, perhaps, but certainly for a respite. To breathe air that didn't feel heavy with forgotten sorrows, to see faces that weren't spectral suggestions in the periphery of his vision. The thought solidified into a plan. He would drive into the nearest town, resupply, perhaps even stay a night in a sterile, modern motel. Just a temporary severance. Rising from the desk, his knees felt stiff, his muscles sluggish. It was as if the very act of standing required immense effort. He moved towards his study, a small, less grand room he had appropriated for his personal effects. As he began to pack his small bag, his movements became increasingly slow, each folded shirt feeling heavier than it should. His gaze drifted to the window. Outside, the sky was a muted gray. The ancient trees framing the manor stood motionless, their branches skeletal against the pallid light. The silence beyond the glass was absolute, a profound absence of sound that pressed in on the house. He picked up his mobile phone. No signal bars. He tried again, holding it aloft, walking to different windows, but the screen remained stubbornly blank, a useless black mirror. He then attempted his laptop, hoping to connect to the satellite internet he'd arranged. He checked the cables, reset the router, but nothing. The internet, like the phone's signal, simply wasn't there. A flicker of frustration, sharp and sudden, pierced the growing lethargy. This was inconvenient, but not insurmountable. He still had his vehicle. He would drive. The drive was short, barely 10 minutes along the winding, tree-lined lane that led from the manor. The road, usually clear, was now strewn with a fresh scattering of fallen leaves and small branches, remnants of a recent, unremembered squall. He reached the mountain pass, the only viable route to civilization. The road here narrowed, carved precariously into the rock face, flanked by sheer drops on one side and towering stone on the other. He slowed, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. He felt it then, a subtle, almost imperceptible pull, a whisper in the quiet chambers of his mind. Turn back. It was not a voice, not a thought he recognized as his own, but an overwhelming, magnetic urge. The idea of proceeding, of leaving the manor behind, suddenly seemed abhorrent, unnatural. A wave of profound anxiety washed over him, a choking fear not of staying, but of departing. The outside world, beyond this pass, felt distant, irrelevant, even hostile. The manor, in contrast, began to feel like the only place he truly belonged, the only place that understood the patterns of his thoughts, the rhythms of his breath. He stopped the vehicle, the engine idling roughly. He stared into the swirling mist, his resolve dissolving like sugar in hot water. The journey felt pointless, an act of rebellion against something vast and ancient. His shoulders slumped. With a sigh that felt torn from his very core, he turned the vehicle around. The drive back was quicker, the fog seemingly lifting from the lane as he approached the gates. The manor, rising from the gray landscape, no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a refuge. Back inside, the quiet settled around him like a familiar cloak. He walked through the echoing halls, the scent of old wood and something indefinable, something ancient and deeply rooted, filling his lungs. The house had drawn his back, and in doing so, had offered a perverse form of solace. Days blurred into an indistinct sequence. He stopped shaving, his jawline becoming obscured by a rough stubble. His clothes, once neat, grew rumpled and stained, ignored. Meals became an afterthought, often skipped entirely, replaced by forgotten biscuits or lukewarm tea. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and disturbed, populated by fragmented images of the manor's past inhabitants, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with a familiar despair. Yet he did not feel hunger, nor did he feel the pressing need for rest. He spent hours, then entire days, poring over the remaining archives, the crumbling documents, the cryptic journals. He was not merely an inhabitant. He was its focal point, its singular obsession. And the isolation, once a source of professional detachment, had now deepened into a suffocating embrace, an almost intimate connection with the malevolent entity that was slowly, meticulously claiming him. The sheer volume of misery pressed in, a palpable weight in the silent room. He pushed away a stack of brittle journals, their pages thin as old skin, and ran a hand over his face. His fingers felt unfamiliar, rougher than he remembered. A faint, acrid smell, like burned sugar and damp earth, clung to his skin, though he couldn't recall encountering anything that would produce it. He stood, needing to move to break the oppressive stillness. The library, with its towering shelves and hushed air, usually offered solace. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. He walked toward the door, a familiar dark oak panel he had passed hundreds of times. But as his hand reached for the brass knob, he paused. The panel seemed to have shifted. A faint, almost imperceptible seam ran vertically down the center where none had been before, as if two separate pieces had been seamlessly joined. He traced it with his thumb. The wood felt cool, smooth, utterly solid. It was an illusion, he told himself, a trick of the light, or perhaps his own exhaustion. He pulled the door open, stepping into the main corridor. He looked back at the library door. It now appeared to be set deeper into the wall, the frame thicker, more ornate than he remembered. He shook his head, a gesture of dismissal, but the unease persisted. He decided to walk to the grand staircase, intending to ascend to his room. He took the usual path, past the portrait gallery. He glanced at a large oil painting of a grim-faced gentleman in a powdered wig, one of the manor's earliest owners. The man's eyes, usually dull and flat, seemed to follow him with an unnerving intensity. Marcus blinked, and the effect vanished. He reached the spot where the staircase should have been. It wasn't there. Instead, a wall, covered in a faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene, stood where the wide, curving steps had always risen. Marcus stared, his breath catching in his throat. This was impossible. He had walked this path every day for weeks. He reached out, pressing his palm against the rough weave of the tapestry. He turned, looking back down the corridor. The library door was gone. In its place, a narrow, unmarked archway led into an unfamiliar, dimly lit space that smelled of dust and forgotten things. His mind reeled. He spun around again. The tapestry was still there. It felt thin, unmoored. He closed his eyes, concentrating. My name is Marcus. I am a historian. I inherited this manor. He opened them. The corridor remained. The wall, the archway. A vivid image flashed into his mind. The biting wind through a mountain pass, the ice clinging to a horse's mane, the agonizing ache in his knees from days in the saddle. He felt the gnawing hunger, the desperate hope for shelter. He remembered the specific fear of the precipice, the sheer drop into the swirling mist below. He even tasted the metallic tang of blood from a chapped lip. But he had never ridden a horse, let alone traversed a mountain pass like that. The memory was sharp, visceral, but it wasn't his. He was certain, or was he? He started walking, choosing a direction at random. Every door he passed seemed new, or subtly altered. Some were taller, some narrower, some had intricate carvings he'd never noticed. He pushed one open. It revealed a small, windowless room, utterly bare save for a single, tarnished brass key lying on the floor. He didn't recognize the room. He didn't recognize the key. He stepped inside, picked up the key. As he turned to leave, the The doorway was gone. The wall was smooth, unbroken. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, irregular rhythm. He was trapped in a room that hadn't existed moments ago, holding a key to a lock he didn't know. He pressed his palms against the wall where the door had been. It was solid, unyielding. Was he Marcus? The line between his memories and those of the house's past residents had not merely blurred. It had dissolved completely. The house was not just changing its structure, it was changing him. The key felt heavier in his hand, a tangible tether to a past that was rapidly becoming his present. The sheer volume of misery pressed in. Marcus sat at the polished mahogany desk, meticulously cataloging each entry, each despairing note. His initial detachment, his scholar's clinical distance, had begun to fray. Not from empathy, but from the relentless, repetitive nature of the suffering. He had expected hauntings, perhaps tragic histories, but what he found was a pattern of dissolution, a systematic unmaking. He unearthed a ledger from the late 18th century, bound in faded green leather, its pages filled with elegant, looping script. It belonged to an overseer, a meticulous man whose early entries detailed supplies and repairs. Later pages, however, shifted. They chronicled not structural decay, but personal erosion. The master's recollections are fractured. One entry reads, "He speaks of a life unlived, of names he cannot place." Another, weeks later, "The mistress, a shadow of her former self. Her gaze holds no recognition for her own children." The overseer himself, in the final entries, began to struggle with syntax, his handwriting deteriorating into a shaky scrawl that spoke of profound mental decline. The boundaries they blur. My own, where is it? Marcus pushed the ledger aside, a cold tendril of unease tightening in his chest. This wasn't simple madness. This was a process, a consistent effect. The early letters discussed architectural peculiarities, the manor's unique acoustics. The later ones, however, grew increasingly agitated. "I feel a drain," one stated. "My thoughts, once so clear, now dissipate like smoke. I find myself forgetting basic facts, portions of my own research. It is as if some invisible current pulls at the very fabric of my mind." The final letter, incomplete and smeared, mentioned a desperate attempt to leave. "I must reach the mountain pass. It is the only way out, before it consumes all." But no further correspondence followed. The mention of the mountain pass resonated. Marcus recalled local legends, hushed tales of travelers attempting to cross it after leaving Blackwood Manor, only to be found days later, wandering aimlessly, their minds blank, their faces slack with an utter absence of self. The air, already still, seemed to thicken, pressing in on his skin. The scent of dust and aged paper, usually comforting, now carried an additional, unsettling undertone, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood, or perhaps something organic, deeply buried. He returned to the ledger, then to the letters, cross-referencing names and dates. The consistency was chilling. Over centuries, a repeating phenomenon, inhabitants of Blackwood Manor experienced a gradual erosion of memory, a fading of personal history, a depletion of their cognitive faculties, often culminating in a complete vacuity of self, or a physical wasting that mirrored their mental state. It was not merely misfortune or a predisposition to melancholy. It was an active extraction. As he read, a strange sensation pricked at the edges of Marcus's own awareness. He paused, trying to recall the exact details of the breakfast he'd eaten that morning. The color of the plate, the pattern on the tablecloth. The images were hazy, indistinct. He attributed it to fatigue, a natural consequence of his relentless research. The features were there, but the clarity, the sharp edges of recognition, were softened as if viewed through a distorting lens. He scanned the oldest texts, those written in archaic script, their pages brittle and yellowed. Here, the language was less restrained, more visceral. "The house hungers," one passage, dated 1642, declared. "It does not merely stand, it absorbs. It draws the very essence from those within its walls, is slow and deliberate consumption of vitality and thought." Another, a crude drawing accompanying a fragmented journal from the late 17th century, depicted a skeletal figure, not a ghost, a human form from which wisps of light, like vapor, were being pulled into the manor's foundation. The caption, in a barely legible hand, read, "The Maw of Blackwood." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. This was not a house merely haunted by the past. It was the past, in a sense. It was a predatory entity, a living structure that fed on the memories, the sanity, the very life force of its inhabitants. It didn't just contain tragedy. It manufactured it. It wasn't a vessel for lingering spirits. It was a vast, silent, organic mechanism for absorption. The walls no longer felt like solid boundaries, but like a tightening embrace. He was not merely studying a historical phenomenon. He was experiencing it. His own fading memories, his moments of mental fog, were not symptoms of exhaustion, but evidence of the manor's current meal. He was its current, preferred meal. His scholarly determination, his deep dive into its history, his intellectual curiosity, These had not protected him. They had made him more palatable. He had opened himself to its influence, laid bare his mind for its consumption. The manor was not a passive observer of human suffering. It was an active, malevolent participant, and he, Marcus, was the feast. He was trapped, and it was feeding. A sudden, violent jolt ripped through Marcus. It was as if a thick, viscous film had been torn from his perception, revealing the harsh, unbearable clarity beneath. He stood in the grand hall, a cold, oppressive weight settling on his chest. The ornate wallpaper, which had seemed to writhe with ancestral faces moments ago, was now merely peeling, damp, and stained. The air, previously thick with phantom incense, carried only the scent of decay and dust. This was a sliver of true awareness, a desperate countercurrent against the overwhelming tide of the house's influence. It was a brief, agonizing moment of sanity, and it screamed at him, "Escape! Destroy! Fight!" The thought hammered against his skull, sharp and precise. The entity, this living structure, was feeding. It had been feeding on him, on his memories, his very identity, twisting his past into its own grotesque narrative. He felt a part of him was gone, absorbed. He had to resist. He would resist. A tremor ran through the floorboards beneath his feet, a low thrum that vibrated up his spine. The house, he knew, was aware. It was sensing his defiance, pushing back, trying to re-establish its dominion. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing himself to move. His legs felt heavy, as if wading through unseen resistance. He needed a way out, a way to stop it. Logic, a faculty he thought long lost, clawed its way back into his mind. The house was an ancient thing, perhaps even primordial. Such entities often had weaknesses, vulnerabilities, forgotten rituals that could bind or destroy them. He had devoured countless texts on folklore, on obscure historical practices. There had to be something. He started his search in a frantic, almost uncoordinated manner. His gaze swept the hall, then darted to the library. The library, its shelves held not just books, but the collective memory of the manor's inhabitants. If a clue existed, it would be there. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminated like tiny, frantic spirits. He tore through volumes on architecture, local history, genealogy. Not there. He felt the mental tendrils of the house probing, attempting to re-engage, to lull his back into its passive acceptance. He grit his teeth, pushing them back with a force he hadn't known he possessed. He remembered a faint, metallic tang emanating from that corner on previous occasions, a scent he had dismissed as old paper and damp. Now, it was sharper, like iron or old blood. He tugged at the shelf. It was stiff, unmoving. He pulled harder, his muscles straining, the wood groaning in protest. With a sudden, jarring lurch, the entire section swung inward, revealing a narrow, dust-choked passage. His phone's flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rough-hewn stone walls, unlike the finished masonry of the main house. This was older, deeper. The passage sloped downwards, narrowing as it went. He could hear his own ragged breathing, amplified by the confined space. The house was trying to deter him. He could feel its displeasure like a palpable pressure against his skin. He pressed on, determined. The passage opened into a small, circular chamber. In the center, on a crudely carved stone pedestal, lay a single object, a tarnished silver locket intricately engraved with symbols he didn't immediately recognize. Around the chamber, etched into the rough rock walls, were more of these symbols, forming a complex, sprawling diagram. And beneath the locket, half obscured by centuries of dust, was a parchment scroll. The script was archaic, a mix of Latin and an older, guttural tongue he barely recognized. But the illustrations were clear enough. The text spoke of a binding stone, a heart of the earth, and a severing of the ancient pact. It described the manor as a devouring maw, anchored to this mountain passed by an eldritch connection, drawing its sustenance from the land and the lives within its walls. The locket, the scroll indicated, was a key, a vessel for the pure intent required to perform the severing ritual. It was a terrifying prospect. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, a willing conduit of spirit, and the precise alignment of specific elements of the mountain pass itself. It was not a destruction, but a severing, a cutting off of the house's lifeline. And the price was left ominously vague. Beyond a conduit of spirit, Marcus stared at the locket, then at the intricate diagram. The house had inadvertently shown him its genesis, its weakness. This was not an escape. It was a battle, a slim, terrifying chance. The metallic tang in the air intensified, and the low thrum beneath his feet became a distinct, rhythmic pulse like a vast, slow heartbeat. The house was awake, and it was furious. The rhythmic thrum beneath Marcus's feet intensified, vibrating through the ancient floorboards, up his legs, and into his sternum. It was no longer a subtle tremor but a distinct, heavy pulse, like a vast, subterranean heart. The metallic tang in the air, sharp and coppery, filled his nostrils, a taste of rust and something less definable, something hungry. He clutched the locket, its cold metal pressing into his palm, the intricate diagram etched into the inner surface a beacon in the encroaching dread. This was not an escape, it was a battle. He understood that now. The house knew his intent. He moved, driven by a desperate clarity. The library, where he'd found the diagram, felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap, its towering shelves looming with a predatory stillness. He needed to reach the central hearth, the source of the house's warmth, its lifeblood, as the diagram implied. As he stepped into the main corridor, a heavy oak door at the far end, one he knew to be a linen closet, slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled the very plaster from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows. Marcus flinched, his breath catching. It wasn't a draft. The air was still heavy, thick with a metallic scent. A low groan emanated from the floor, a sound that seemed to rise from the deep foundations of the manor itself, a sound of ancient wood straining under an unseen pressure. He pressed forward, the locket now a burning ember in his hand, his resolve hardening against the rising tide of unease. The corridor, usually long and somewhat grand, seemed to stretch, its perspective warping. The walls rippled, the floral patterns on the faded wallpaper seeming to writhe, their delicate tendrils elongating, reaching. A cold current, sharp and sudden, whipped around his ankles, tripping him. He stumbled, catching himself against a wall that felt suddenly slimy, slick with an unseen film. He pulled his hand back, repulsed, examining his fingers for any residue, but found none. It was a phantom sensation, yet utterly convincing. His path to the great hall, and then the hearth, was through a series of smaller parlors. As he entered the first, a crystal chandelier, suspended by a thick, tarnished chain, began to sway violently. The individual prisms clinked together, a frenzied, discordant chime. He stared, transfixed as the swaying intensified, the entire fixture groaning as if about to tear free from the ceiling. The house wanted him to yield to terror. He would not. He pushed open the door to the next parlor. The room was plunged into an unnatural gloom. From the deepest recess, a form began to emerge, not solid, not quite transparent, but a shimmering distortion of the air, vaguely humanoid. It was tall, gaunt, its head tilted as if in perpetual agony. As he watched, mesmerized by a primal fear, the figure raised a spectral arm, its hand a blur of insubstantial energy, and pointed directly at him. The house wasn't just physical, it was psychological. It was trying to break his mind, to make him one of them. He spun, retreating from the spectral figure, opting for an alternate route through a disused dining room. A gale-force wind, though no windows were open, tore through the room, sending ancient tapestries flapping wildly, their frayed threads whipping like angry serpents. Plates on the long, dust-shrouded table slid, scraping against the polished wood, then crashed to the floor, shattering into countless shards that skittered across the floor like malevolent insects. Marcus shielded his face, the metallic tang now so intense it burned his sinuses. He stumbled, falling to his knees. The floor beneath him began to shift, to buckle. The very architecture of the house seemed to groan, the walls leaning inward, the ceiling pressing down. He felt a profound sense of pressure, as if the weight of the entire manor was settling upon him. He looked up, his gaze drawn to the far wall. The wall blurred, shimmering like heat haze over asphalt, then dissolved entirely. In its place, a landscape materialized, impossibly vast and starkly vivid, as if he stood at its precipice. Jagged, snow-capped peaks clawed at a bruised sky. He felt the icy spray on his face, the grit of loose rock beneath his boots. The house was not just showing him visions, it was putting him there, forcing him to experience the ultimate vulnerability, the utter insignificance of life against an overwhelming, indifferent force. Then, at the edge of his vision, a figure emerged from the blizzard, a shrouded form, indistinct but radiating an immense, ancient malevolence. It moved toward the struggling figure of Marcus on the ledge, its form growing, eclipsing the sky. The house was trying to show him his end, to break his will, to make him believe this inevitable absorption. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, the locket now searing hot against his palm. He remembered the diagram, the weakness. This was the house's final, desperate attempt to consume him. He would fight. The cold metal of the locket pressed against Marcus's palm, a small, solid anchor in a world that had begun to fray. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating silence of the manor. The house was not merely walls and timber. It was a hungry consciousness, a predator of the mind. He pushed forward, the air growing thick, heavy, as if he were wading through a viscous fluid. The manor's oppressive silence was punctuated by a faint, distant whisper, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a parched landscape. It was not a physical sound, he knew, but an echo within his skull, a prelude to the assault. He tightened his grip on the locket, its familiar weight a quiet defiance against the encroaching chaos. The corridor ahead, one he had traversed countless times, began to shift. The familiar wainscoting warped, the aged wallpaper peeling not in strips, but in vast, rippling sheets that dissolved into a hazy, formless gray. The temperature plummeted, a sudden, biting chill that seeped into his bones, far colder than any draft. He felt the stone beneath his boots give way to something rougher, uneven. The walls themselves seemed to recede, replaced by an expanse of churning mist. He blinked, fighting the disorientation. When his vision cleared, he was no longer in the manor. The transition was seamless, terrifying in its completeness. He stood on a narrow, precarious path of scree and jagged rock. Above, a sky the color of bruised lead stretched endlessly, pressing down with an immense, palpable weight. The air was thin, sharp, scouring his lungs with each desperate inhale. This was the mountain pass. The path clung precariously to the side of an enormous, sheer cliff face that disappeared upwards into the roiling gray. He understood now. This was the house's core, a manifestation of its ancient, predatory essence, designed to isolate and break. Figures, indistinct and shimmering, clinging to the edges of the path, half-formed, half dissolved into the swirling mist. They were echoes, fragments of memory, of identity, the husks of those who had come before him. Their silent, vacant gazes fixed upon him, not accusatory, but yearning, a profound, unquenchable hunger that mirrored the house's own. They were the then he had feared becoming. Their presence was a silent promise of his own dissolution. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over him, threatening to buckle his knees. It was more than physical fatigue. It was a weariness of the soul, a sudden, crushing awareness of the futility of his struggle. Give in, a voice, not his own, seemed to sigh on the wind. Join us. Memories began to slip, like grains of sand through his fingers. His name, Marcus. His profession, historian. The face of a distant colleague. All became hazy, indistinct, dissolving into the pervasive gray. His plan, fragile as it was, revolved around this object. The locket was not merely a family heirloom. It was a key, a historical anomaly. He had discovered its true significance in the manor's archives, a desperate, half-mad scrawl in an old journal. It was imbued with a faint, residual energy, a counterforce. He had to activate it, to channel its resistance, to sever the house's psychic tendrils from his own mind. He stumbled forward, fighting the illusion, fighting the urge to surrender. The wind howled, a chorus of silent screams. The ground beneath his feet shifted, threatening to crumble, to send him plunging into the unseen depths. The figures around him grew bolder, their vacant eyes closer, their shimmering forms reaching, not to touch, but to envelop, to absorb. He could feel his own memories being siphoned, the warmth of a childhood summer, the scent of old books, the quiet satisfaction of a discovery. All fading, becoming part of the hungry collective. He drew the locket close, pressing it hard against his sternum. The mountain pass rippled, the sky above flickering with impossible colors. The figures around him shrieked, a soundless scream that vibrated through his very bones, a chorus of denial and rage. The ground beneath him convulsed, cracks spiderwebbing across the rock, threatening to shatter. The battle for his mind had begun in earnest. The previous encounter had left him reeling, a primal fear churning in his gut, but the flicker of understanding had solidified into a desperate resolve. He would not become another forgotten whisper within those walls. He would leave. The journey had been a blur of frantic motion, a desperate scramble through echoing hallways and crumbling staircases, each creak ingrown a hungry sigh from the entity he sought to escape. He stood on a precarious ledge of the mountain pass, the wind a relentless, mournful shriek around him, whipping at his threadbare coat and threatening to scour the very thoughts from his mind. Below, the jagged, snow-dusted peaks stretched into an endless, gray expanse, a brutal majesty that offered no comfort, only indifference. His legs ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue, each muscle protesting the exertion. His hands, raw and scraped, trembled as he gripped a protruding rock for balance. He had climbed, he had pushed, he had fought his way through the suffocating embrace of the manor's influence, and now, finally, he was outside. The vastness of the mountain pass was a stark, almost painful contrast to the claustrophobic interiors he had fled. Only the clean, biting scent of ice and rock, and the roar of the wind. A fragile sense of triumph bloomed in his chest, quickly overshadowed by a gnawing emptiness. Was this truly escape, or merely a new, grander prison? The manor had blurred the lines of his perception for so long he found himself scrutinizing every gust of wind, every shifting cloud, searching for the telltale signs of its insidious presence. It felt cool, substantial, a reassuring weight. He began to walk, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the lingering tendrils of fear. The ground was uneven, a treacherous mix of loose scree and patches of hard-packed snow. His boots crunched loudly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind. It felt real. It had to be real. As he moved, a subtle shift occurred. The wind's howl began to take on a peculiar cadence, a rhythmic ebb and flow that seemed to resonate with a low, insistent hum inside his skull. He paused, straining to hear beyond the natural sounds of the past. Was it merely the blood rushing in his ears, or something else? Yet, the hum persisted, a deep thrumming that felt intimately connected to his own pulse. He reached a small, sheltered alcove in the rock face, seeking a brief respite from the relentless wind. He leaned against the cold stone, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. The locket, still clutched in his hand, now felt strangely warm, almost radiating a faint heat. He opened his palm, examining the tarnished silver. The intricate carving on its surface seemed to shimmer, the lines of the ancient symbol blurring and reforming in his vision. Then he felt it, not a sound, not a sight, but a profound, undeniable presence within him. It felt like a deep, ancient root that had burrowed into the very core of his being, a sprawling network of forgotten memories and dormant hungers that now stirred. He tried to push it away, to reclaim his singular self, but it was like trying to separate water from water. He raised his hands, staring at them. He looked up at the gray sky, at the indifferent peaks, and a horrifying realization dawned. The manor had not merely fed on him, it had absorbed him. Not entirely, but fundamentally. He had not escaped its walls, he had become a part of its outward reach. It was a fragment, a seed. The wind on the mountain pass no longer sounded like a natural phenomenon. Marcus stood on the mountain pass, a lone figure against the indifferent expanse. He was out, undeniably. The manor was far behind him, a distant silhouette against the horizon. Yet, he was no longer simply Marcus. He was a vessel, a living conduit, carrying a piece of the entity into the desolate world. The hunger that had driven the manor, the slow, insatiable need for life and memory, now stirred within his own consciousness, a nascent, terrifying awareness that he could never truly escape. He was free and irrevocably bound, an echo of the manor walking the earth, forever entwined.